The reading room on the third floor of Aldenmore Library smelled of old binding paste and the particular cold that stone buildings hold even in April. Clara Voss had her dictionary open to the Sigma entries and her left hand pressed flat beside it, the way she pressed a surface when she was thinking and did not know she was doing it. The papyrus fragment in the acid-free sleeve before her was the 43rd she had handled that afternoon. She had been there since noon. The clock above the archive door read 5:20, and no one had asked her to come, and no one knew she was there. And the thing she was building, column by column, in the handwritten index beside her elbow, was the most complete accounting of the library's uncatalogued Greek papyrus holdings that had ever existed. She did not know that the man who had been sitting 2 tables away for the past 4 weeks was, at that precise moment, reading a document with his own name printed in the upper left corner. She did not know that the document also contained the words she had spent most of that month trying not to repeat to herself in the dark before sleeping. She knew only that the 43rd fragment bore a partial inventory notation in a later hand, Ptolemaic era, likely administrative, and that she had cross-referenced it against 2 entries in the Leuven papyrus database and confirmed a probable provenance match. She wrote the notation in her index, closed the sleeve carefully, and set it with the others. Pull back from that moment, from that specific afternoon and that particular stack of acid-free sleeves, and Clara's world comes into clearer proportion. She had worked at Aldenmore for 7 years. Her position was officially titled Classical Languages Support Specialist, a title so hedged with the word support that it communicated to anyone fluent in institutional language that the person holding it was auxiliary, temporary. In the way that certain things become permanently temporary, the annual contract renewed each October with a letter that noted her continued contributions and reminded her that renewal was contingent on budgetary review. She had a desk in the research division's back corridor between a supply closet and a window that faced an interior courtyard where nothing grew. She had a library card with a special designation that allowed her to pull restricted access materials, which she did dozens of times each week on behalf of researchers who could not read the languages the materials were written in. What Clara could read and had been able to read since she was 19 years old, and her professor at the university had recognized something unusual in the way she passed an aorist, was ancient Greek in several dialects, Latin in both classical and medieval registers, Coptic in its Sahidic form, and enough Demotic Egyptian to navigate a papyrus with care. She had not completed her doctorate. She had come within 8 months of it. And then her mother had fallen ill, and then the funding had ended, and then she had found this position, which paid less than a schoolteacher and more than nothing, and which allowed her to spend her days with the things she loved. That was the shape of her life when it was going well. The shape of her life when it was not going well was largely determined by Miriam Holt. Miriam was the director of the Research and Special Collections Division, and she had been for 11 years, and she understood libraries the way a general understands a supply line. What flowed where, who controlled which gate, and what the metric was for justifying each expenditure to the people who held the purse. She was not cruel in the way that people who lack imagination are sometimes cruel. She was precise, and she believed in measurable outputs, and Clara Voss produced outputs that were difficult to measure in the units Miriam used. Researchers thanked Clara in acknowledgement sections of published articles. Graduate students sent handwritten notes when their dissertations were approved. None of this appeared in any column of the spreadsheet Miriam kept, because gratitude had no budgetary line. Miriam was 51, dressed always in structured grey or blue, and wore reading glasses on a chain of dark beads that she handled the way a magistrate handles a gavel, taking them up when she required authority and setting them down when she did not. She had never asked Clara what a papyrus fragment said. She had asked Clara twice to justify her access to the restricted shelf in writing, which Clara had done, and the justifications had not been questioned further, but had not been filed in any place Clara could verify. The morning Charles arrived, Clara had been in the reading room since 8, working on a transliteration request for a visiting researcher from the University of Edinburgh, who needed 3 pages of a Byzantine manuscript rendered into English by Thursday. It was a Monday. Clara had the manuscript open beside her own notebook, and she was writing in the particular small cursive she used for transliteration work. The letters slightly enlarged to compensate for what she had learned was the default rendering quality of the scanner the research office used to send her drafts. She heard the reading room door open. She did not look up. Researchers came and went, and her habit was to register the sound and continue until a voice addressed her, or a shadow fell across her page. The shadow did not fall. The voice did not come. She became aware only when she paused to check a verb ending in her Lampe lexicon that someone had settled 2 tables to her left and was reading. She looked then, the way you look at a room's edges when your focal point shifts for a moment. He was perhaps 35. Dark jacket, not new, the kind of jacket that had been good once and was still serviceable. A stack of books at his left elbow, which she clocked without particular thought as the Loeb Classical Library editions of Tacitus, a facsimile of something she could not identify at this distance, and what appeared to be Courtney's commentary on Juvenal. His hands were resting on an open notebook. He was reading with the quality of attention that certain people have, the kind that does not announce itself, that simply removes the person from the room's social current and deposits them somewhere else entirely. Clara looked back at her manuscript. At 10:30, she went to the restricted shelf to retrieve a parallel text she needed, a Latin-Greek facing edition of Diodorus Siculus that the library owned in the 1888 Becker printing, which was not available digitally and which she had used enough times that she knew exactly where it sat on the shelf and what it smelled like when she opened it. She brought it back to her table, and she noticed on the way that the man 2 tables over had the Courtney open now and was making notes in the margins of his notebook with a pencil he held very lightly, as if he was accustomed to erasing what he wrote. She set the Diodorus on her table. Then she stopped. The Tacitus volumes at his elbow were the Annals and the Histories, which she would have used if she were working in Latin. The facsimile she had not identified from a distance was, she could now see from 4 feet away, a reproduction of a papyrus text, and she recognized the layout from the spine's partial label. It was the Princeton Papyri facsimile, which was Latin, and which was used almost exclusively by people working on Roman documentary texts. Someone working on Roman documentary texts would, depending on what they were looking for, need the Diodorus, not as their primary source, but as a parallel for dating conventions. She did not think about it at any length. She pulled the Diodorus off her own stack and walked the 2 tables. "You may want this," she said, "if you're working on dating conventions in the Princeton material. The parallel text in Becker is the most useful print edition for cross-referencing the calendrical entries." He looked up. His eyes were a clear, attentive grey, and his expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled, the way a room settles when the right word is finally spoken. "Thank you," he said. He looked at the book, and then at her, and then at the book again. "I was going to ask at the desk." The desk wouldn't have known to recommend this one specifically, Clara said, not unkindly. "It's not in the main catalogue under anything useful. I know where things live." "Apparently so," he said. She went back to her table. She did not think about the exchange again until much later, when she understood what it had cost her nothing to give and what, on his side of the table, it had confirmed. His name, she learned the following week in the ordinary way of library proximity, was Charles. He offered it one morning when they both reached for the pencil sharpener at the reference station at the same moment, and she said her name in return. And that was that. He came to the reading room each weekday between 8:30 and 1, and sometimes returned in the afternoons. He was working on something he described when she asked with the straightforward curiosity she extended to most researchers, as a survey of Roman administrative language in Egyptian provincial documents, which was a narrow enough subject that she mentioned 2 articles she knew of in a German journal he might not have encountered, and he wrote down the citations without asking her to slow down. She mentioned this to Ruth Sable that same week, leaning against the returns desk while Ruth processed a cart of folios. "Someone new in the reading room," Clara said. "Latin and papyrology. Knows his way around the texts, but he's missing some of the secondary literature." Ruth was 58, broad-shouldered, and had worked the desk at Aldenmore for 22 years. She processed folios the way other people breathe, without appearing to think about it, her hands moving steadily through the check-in stamps, while she kept her attention on Clara. "Visiting researcher?" He said, "Graduate student. Sabbatical." Ruth set a folio in the completed pile. Older for a graduate student. "People come back to things," Clara said. "They do," Ruth agreed, and her eyes had a quality Clara recognized, a noticing quality. But she did not say anything further, and Clara did not offer more. The staff meeting that Thursday was held in the conference room adjacent to Miriam's office, a room with a whiteboard covered in bullet points from the previous month's session that no one had erased. Clara sat at the far end of the table where she always sat, beside the window. There were 8 people at the meeting, including Miriam at the head and the 2 acquisitions librarians and the digital collections coordinator, and 2 junior cataloguers whose names Clara had learned and Miriam had not. The meeting was primarily about the new metadata standards for the digital collection, and Clara had nothing to contribute to that agenda, and she listened without interrupting. Toward the end, under the heading of any other business, Miriam raised the question of the restricted shelf cataloging system. "There are still legacy inconsistencies in the classical materials section," Miriam said, looking at her notes. "The filing doesn't align with the current subject heading schema. Someone needs to reconcile that." "I can do it," Clara said. "I've been meaning to. The legacy headings follow Liddell Scott conventions, which don't map cleanly to the current schema, but I know where the discrepancies are." "The cataloging standard is the current standard," Miriam said, not looking up. "The legacy approach is what's creating the confusion." "The legacy approach is accurate in the classical context," Clara said evenly. "The current standard isn't designed for Greek materials from this period. If I reconcile it, I'd need to add notes to each entry explaining the deviation, or we'll have researchers unable to locate things that are actually there." Miriam looked up then, through her reading glasses, the beads pressing against the collar of her grey jacket. "Clara, the point is consistency across the system. I don't think we need an explanation of why consistency is the goal." The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when everyone present is deciding not to say something. "Of course," Clara said. "I'll add the reconciliation notes as well. It'll take the same amount of time and it'll preserve findability." Miriam's expression did not shift toward agreement or disagreement. She made a note and moved on. Afterward, in the corridor, one of the junior catalogers, a young woman named Petra who had started in January and still looked faintly surprised each morning at the materials she was entrusted with, fell into step beside Clara. "You were right about the headings," Petra said quietly. "I know," Clara said. "That's the less useful fact." Petra considered this. "Is she always like that?" "Miriam is very consistent," Clara said, which was the most accurate thing she could say, and she meant it without malice. and went back to her desk. Over the following 2 weeks, the reading room became the part of Clara's day that she found herself walking toward, with something that was not quite eagerness, but was adjacent to it. Charles was there each morning when she arrived. They did not sit together in any official sense. They each had their own table, their own materials, their own notebooks. What accumulated between them was the ordinary residue of shared space and compatible quiet. He asked her one morning about a Coptic loanword that appeared in a late papyrus he was examining, and she leaned over to look at the photographic reproduction he was working from, and she identified the word without hesitation, and told him the underlying Greek root and the register shift that had occurred during the transmission, and he wrote it down and said thank you in a tone that was not perfunctory, that had weight to it, as if the thing she had just told him mattered, and he understood why. She noticed his hands when he wrote. They were precise and steady. The handwriting small and even, and his pencil moved without the tentative quality she had come to associate with researchers who were still finding their footing in a language. He wrote like someone who trusted what he knew and was building on it, not performing competence for an audience. She noticed that he arrived each morning with coffee from the cart in the lobby, and that the cup was always plain, no sleeve, and that he held it in both hands for the first 10 minutes while it was still warm, apparently not drinking it so much as receiving the heat from it. It was still cold in April. The reading room's radiators were old and cycled in long, uneven intervals. "There's a kettle in the staff kitchen," she said one morning. "If you want to warm it back up." He looked at the cup. "I don't want to take the staff kettle." "It's everyone's kettle," she said. "It's just called the staff kitchen because that's where they put it. The researchers use it too." He looked at her for a moment, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. The thing before a smile, the recognition. "Thank you," he said. She watched him walk towards the archive corridor, and thought, without dwelling on it, that he carried himself differently than most researchers, not with affectation, with something quieter than that. He moved as if he had decided exactly where he was going before he stood, and that decision required no adjustment once made. She filed the observation and returned to her work. It was a Wednesday morning in the 4th week when she heard Miriam's voice through the archive door. Clara had gone to the small archive anteroom at the end of the research corridor to retrieve a folder she had left there the day before, a folder containing her transliteration notes for the Edinburgh researchers' follow-up request. The anteroom connected by a narrow internal passage to the acquisitions meeting room, and the door between them was not fully latched. She understood this only in retrospect, after she had already heard the first full sentence. Miriam was speaking to someone, 2 voices in answer, which meant it was likely the Acquisitions Committee meeting that Clara had seen on the weekly calendar. 3 people and a closed door and a budget. "The classical languages function," Miriam said, "is currently occupied by 1 staff member on an annual contract. The position produces no measurable output that can't be replicated by outsourcing individual translation requests to a vendor pool." A pause. One of the acquisitions voices said something Clara could not fully hear. "No," Miriam said. "The question I'm putting to the committee is whether we carry a full-time specialist salary for a function that generates no externally visible value. The papyrus collection is not a lending collection. The classical materials are consulted by fewer than 40 researchers a year. The cost per use calculation does not support a permanent position. Honestly, it barely supports the annual contract." Another pause. "My recommendation to the Foundation," Miriam continued, "when they conduct the site visit next month, will be that the classical languages line be eliminated and the associated budget redirected to digital infrastructure. That's where the use numbers are." Clara stood in the anteroom with the folder in her hands. She was aware of the folder's weight, which was not significant. She was aware of the light in the anteroom, which came from a single ceiling fixture and gave everything a yellowish cast. She was aware that her breath had become very deliberate, the way it becomes deliberate when the body registers something before the mind has finished processing it. She stayed there for what might have been 30 seconds, or longer, until she heard the acquisitions meeting continue on to its next item, the digital licensing costs for the periodicals database, and then she walked back down the corridor to her desk and sat down and set the folder beside her notebook. 7 years. The word eliminating. She sat with it for a long time, long enough that Ruth appeared at her desk with a cup of tea that Clara had not asked for and set it on the edge of the desk without comment. "You look like someone walked over something," Ruth said. "I'm fine," Clara said. Ruth looked at her for a moment with the honest, unceremonious attention she brought to most things. "All right," she said, and went back to the desk. Clara drank the tea. She opened her notebook to the page where she had been working on the Edinburgh transliteration, and she read the last 3 lines she had written, and she understood them, and she continued from where she had stopped. That evening she sat at her own kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper, and she made a list. Not of complaints, not of arguments she might present to Miriam, or documentation of her contributions, or anything that required an audience. What she wrote was a list of the 43 uncatalogued Greek papyrus fragments sitting in acid-free sleeves in the archive anteroom, fragments she had identified over the past 2 years as belonging to the library's collection, but which had never been formally indexed because the indexing had never been assigned to anyone, and she was the only person in the building who could do it, and she had been waiting, in the way she waited for most things, for the right time. She understood, sitting at her kitchen table with the coffee cooling in its cup, that there was no right time, and there never had been. There was only the work and whether the work was done. She went in the next morning at her usual time. She told no one what she planned. She spent the morning on the Edinburgh request, finished it before noon, sent it, and then she took her lunch hour and the 2 hours after it, time she was not required to account for, and she went to the archive anteroom with her notebook, her pencil, her Liddell Scott, her Leuven database access on the library's shared terminal, and she began. The first fragment took her 40 minutes. The handwriting was a Ptolemaic cursive she had seen before, but not in this particular scribe's hand, and she had to work slowly, letter by letter at first, until the shapes became familiar and the words began to resolve. It was an administrative inventory, a list of linen goods with quantities, and it was not significant literature, but it was real, and it was ancient, and it had been sitting unnamed in a sleeve since at least the 1960s, when the library had received a donation from the estate of an Egyptologist who had apparently collected more than he catalogued. By the 3rd fragment she had found her pace. By the 12th she had identified a pattern. 3 of the fragments appeared to come from the same administrative archive, the same scribal hand, the same papyrus quality, and she noted the connection in her index and cross-referenced all 3. By the 31st she was working with the practiced fluency that comes from sustained immersion, the language speaking itself through her pencil without the friction of translation. She came back the following day and the day after. She worked through the remainder of the fragments in her afternoon time, each one handled with the same care, each notation written in the same small, precise script. The 43rd fragment she completed on a Thursday, and she set it in the sleeve and placed it with the others, and she read back through the index she had built, and it was complete, and it was accurate, and it was the most detailed accounting of those materials the library had ever possessed. She brought it to her desk. She did not present it to anyone. She set it in the drawer where she kept active projects, and she went back to the day's work. Charles was at his table. He looked up when she came in, and she sat at her table, and there was a moment, brief but distinct, where their attention occupied the same space without either of them speaking, and she was aware of him in the way she had been increasingly aware of him over the past weeks, a specific, grounded awareness, the kind that does not require analysis. "You've been in the archive," he said, not a question. "Yes." "Working on something?" "Cataloguing," she said. "The papyrus collection. It needed doing." He was quiet for a moment. "How many?" 43, she said. He looked at her for a beat, and then he looked down at his notebook, and she understood from the quality of his silence that he was not done with the conversation. But he did not continue it, and she returned to her work. The site visit was announced on a Tuesday morning by an email from Miriam to all research division staff. It informed them that the Foster Foundation, which provided the principal endowment for Aldenmore's special collections, including the classical materials, would be conducting its annual site assessment the following Thursday. Staff were expected to be present and available. The visiting panel would include 2 foundation trustees and 1 consulting assessor. The library's annual funding report would be presented in the afternoon session. Clara read the email and noted the date and returned to the fragment she was transliterating for an Italian research consortium that had discovered 2 of the newly indexed papyri in her catalogue, which she had shared with a colleague in Rome, who had forwarded it to the consortium, which had written to the library requesting photographic reproductions and assistance with interpretation. Ruth appeared at the desk doorway that afternoon. "Did you see the Foundation email?" "Yes," Clara said. "Miriam's been in her office since 9 with the door shut. She'll be preparing the funding report." Ruth leaned against the doorframe. "You know what she's recommending to them." Clara set down her pencil. "How do you know?" "Petra told me. She wasn't eavesdropping. She was in the acquisitions room to deliver the binding invoices, and she heard the end of it, and she came to me because she didn't know what to do." Clara was quiet. "What are you going to do?" Ruth asked. "My work," Clara said. Ruth studied her for a moment. "That's not nothing, you know." "I know," Clara said, and she meant it, and she picked up her pencil. Thursday arrived with the particular quality of a day that has been anticipated long enough to take on a slightly formal texture. Clara came in at her usual time and sat at her desk, and worked until 9:30, when she moved, as she always moved at 9:30, to the reading room with the materials for the morning. Charles was not at his table. She noticed this without alarm. Researchers change their schedules. She set out her notebook and her dictionary, and the photographic reproductions the Italian consortium had sent. And she began. At 10 o'clock, she heard voices in the reading room corridor, the particular collective sound of a group moving with purpose. Through the reading room's interior window, she could see, briefly, a cluster of people in the hallway outside Miriam's office, and Miriam among them, and 2 people she did not recognize. And then a third person who was, she saw with a small adjustment of her attention, Charles. He was wearing a different jacket, a good one, not the worn, serviceable jacket of the past 4 weeks, but a dark jacket that fit him with the quality of something made specifically for the person wearing it. He was standing slightly to the side of the group, listening to something Miriam was saying, with the same quality of attention she had watched him bring to his notebook for 4 weeks, that calm, unhurried attention, and he was not performing anything. She looked back at her photographic reproduction. Miriam brought the group into the reading room at 10:15. There were introductions, the formal kind, which Clara heard from 2 tables away. "Dr. Vass from the Foundation Trustees," Miriam said, gesturing to the first visitor. "Mr. Ellison from the Assessments Committee." And then, with a slight pause that Clara caught even from her table, "And Mr. Foster, who is this year's consulting assessor." Mr. Foster. Clara was looking at the photographic reproduction when she heard the name, and she set it down and looked up. Charles was looking at her. His expression was even and composed, and something under it, something she did not have a word for yet, was waiting. The name was on the foundation panel's printed documentation that Miriam was carrying, which she set on the reading room's central table for the trustees to consult. Clara could see it from her table, the letterhead, and in the upper section under Consulting Assessors, the name in plain type, Charles Foster, the Foster Foundation. She understood it then in the way you understand something that has been almost in view for a long time, not as a shock, but as a settling. The Becker edition of Diodorus Siculus, the Coptic loanword, the Princeton papyri facsimile, the coffee cup held in both hands. None of it was performance. All of it was who he was. Miriam was saying something to Dr. Vass about the digital collection's access metrics. She had not yet looked at Clara. Ruth appeared in the reading room doorway at the far end, behind the visiting panel. She had the look of someone who had been waiting to see where a particular weather system made landfall, and she was watching Clara with an attention that was warm and steady and said nothing aloud. The funding presentation was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the main conference room. Clara was not on the agenda. She was in the archive anteroom at 1:15, retrieving a photographic reproduction when she heard footsteps in the corridor, and then Charles was in the doorway. "I should have told you," he said. She looked at him. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I wanted to know what this place was when no one was performing for it. That's what a site visit is. What you see when people don't know you're watching." "I was always working," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I saw." She looked down at the photographic reproduction in her hands. "Miriam is going to recommend eliminating the classical languages line." "Yes," he said. "I've read her report." She looked up. His expression had the quality of someone who has already decided and is waiting for the room to catch up. "The index you built," he said. "The 43 papyri. When did you do that?" "Over the past 2 weeks, afternoons. On your own time." "It needed doing." He was quiet again, and the silence had the particular weight of something being placed carefully where it belonged. "The Foundation's assessment will note that the library's classical languages specialist has, without assignment or additional compensation, produced the first complete index of the uncatalogued papyrus collection, confirmed provenance on 3 archival clusters, and established an active research relationship with an Italian consortium whose institutional connection represents a new external partnership for the library." Clara set the photographic reproduction down. "You already wrote that." "This morning," he said. "It was accurate." "It was going to be accurate whether or not you wrote it." "Yes," he said. "That's the point." She looked at him for a moment. Charles Foster, who had sat 2 tables away for 4 weeks, with a worn jacket and a cup of coffee and the Annals of Tacitus, and who had not said a word of any of this, and who had watched her be exactly who she was when she thought no one of consequence was looking. "The presentation is at 2, she said. "It is," he said. "I'll be at my desk." "I know where your desk is," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it had moved the morning she told him about the staff kettle. That thing before a smile, and she went back to the reading room, and he went down the corridor toward the conference room, and the afternoon opened in front of both of them. She heard about it from Ruth, who had positioned herself near the conference room with the entirely legitimate purpose of returning a stack of reserve folios to the adjacent shelf. Miriam's presentation had gone as Clara had imagined it. The access metrics, the cost per use analysis, the recommendation to redirect the classical languages budget. Dr. Vass had listened. Mr. Ellison had made notes. Charles had asked Miriam, Ruth reported, to confirm the date on which the classical languages specialist had last been given a formal assignment to catalogue the papyrus collection. Miriam had said that the papyrus collection cataloguing had not been formally assigned. Charles had asked whether the Foundation was correct in its understanding that the collection had remained uncatalogued for the duration of the current specialist's tenure, approximately 7 years. Miriam had said that was substantially correct. Charles had placed on the conference table, Ruth said, a document of 43 entries, each with provenance notation, cross-references, and a database confirmation number, completed in the past 2 weeks, produced without assignment, on the specialist's own time. The room had been quiet for a moment. She said, Ruth told Clara at the returns desk that evening, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone reporting an earthquake's exact coordinates. She said, "And I'm telling you exactly what I heard because I was standing right there," she said. "I was not aware this had been completed." "What did he say?" Clara asked. "He said, 'That appears to be the pattern.'" Clara was quiet. "And then," Ruth continued, "Dr. Vass said she would like to meet the specialist whose work they were reviewing. And Miriam said you were in the reading room, and Dr. Vass said, 'Then perhaps we should go to the reading room.'" They came to her at 3:30. Miriam came first because she was leading the group and it was her library, and her corridor, and her reading room. And she opened the reading room door with the practiced authority of someone who has never had to knock in her own building. Behind her came Dr. Vass, a compact woman in her 60s with an assessing gaze, and Mr. Ellison with his notes, and Charles. Clara was at her table with the Italian consortium's photographic reproductions. She looked up when they came in. "Clara," Miriam said with the particular evenness of someone navigating unfamiliar ground without a map. "Dr. Vass would like to speak with you about the papyrus catalogue." "Of course," Clara said, and she stood, because Dr. Vass was worth standing for, and she would have stood for anyone who came to the table with a genuine question. Dr. Vass introduced herself and sat in the chair across the table from Clara, and they talked for 40 minutes. Clara showed her the index. She explained the Ptolemaic scribal conventions and the administrative archive cluster she had identified, and Dr. Vass asked 2 or 3 questions that confirmed she had read papyri before and was not asking for the performance of expertise but for its substance. And Clara answered without performance. At the table's edge, she was aware of Miriam standing and of Charles standing beside the window where the late afternoon light came in at a low angle and made the room feel warmer than the morning had promised. She did not look at him. She talked to Dr. Vass about papyrus. At the end of the 40 minutes, Dr. Vass said, "The Foundation will be updating its assessment of the classical languages function. I expect you'll hear from us by end of the month." "Thank you," Clara said. Miriam said nothing. Ruth was at the desk when Clara passed on the way to the supply closet for the archive sleeves she needed. Their eyes met. Ruth gave a single, very small nod. The nod of someone who has kept faith with a particular outcome for 7 years and is relieved, simply relieved, to see it arrive. The following days passed with the ordinary texture of work and quiet. Miriam stopped appearing in the reading room on the pretext of checking materials. The cataloguers who had been at the Thursday meeting moved through the corridor with a slightly adjusted awareness of Clara's desk and its occupant, not deferential exactly, but awake in a way they had not been before. The letter from the Foster Foundation arrived on a Monday, addressed to the library director and copied to Miriam and to Clara. It confirmed the continuation of the Classical Languages Endowment line. It noted the newly completed papyrus index as evidence of active scholarly productivity. It recommended that the position be restructured as permanent rather than annually reviewed, and that the specialist be given a formal mandate to continue the cataloguing and interpretation work, with a budget line for materials and database access. It was signed by 2 trustees and by Charles Foster as consulting assessor. Clara read it at her desk. She folded it and set it in the drawer. She did not see Charles again that morning or the one that followed, and she did not expect to. Site visits ended. Assessors returned to wherever assessors returned to. The reading room was hers, and the archive was hers, and the work was hers. And that was enough, and it had always been enough, and she knew the difference now between that being a consolation and its being the truth. He came back on Wednesday, not the worn jacket, the good jacket again. He came through the reading room door at 8:40, and he had 2 cups of coffee from the lobby cart, with sleeves this time, and he set one on the edge of her table without asking, and sat down 2 tables over and opened his notebook. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. He was already reading. She picked up the cup. The coffee was the right temperature, which meant he had waited for it to cool slightly before he brought it up, because he knew the walk from the cart to the reading room, and he had calculated the difference. She understood, holding the cup, that this was the kind of attention he had been paying to everything for 4 weeks, and possibly longer, and that she had been paying it back in her own way without knowing she was doing it. She set the cup beside her dictionary, and she opened her notebook, and she began to write, the Greek letters forming in their small, precise line across the page, and the reading room settled around her into its particular quiet, the radiators cycling, the light coming through the high windows at its April angle, the room containing 2 people at 2 tables, with their notebooks and their coffee, doing the work they were built to do, and belonging, both of them, completely. The Becker edition of Diodorus Siculus was on her table, where she had placed it after returning it from the restricted shelf that morning. She had not needed it yet for the day's work. She set her hand flat beside it, the way she set a surface when she was thinking and did not know she was doing it, and the weight of it under her palm was the weight of something she had known a long time, familiar and specific and right.